May 1945. While the world cheered for peace, General George S. Patton was already eyeing the next enemy. At a victory banquet, a Soviet general raised a glass for a toast of friendship, but Patton remained frozen. His response was so brutal, so insulting, that the translator was paralyzed with fear. This is the story of the toast that predicted the Cold War and nearly ignited World War III. Following Germany's surrender on May 8th, Patton's Third Army was stationed in Austria and Czechoslovakia, possessing the finest equipment and combat experience in the world. However, instead of triumph, the general felt a profound sense of dread. He watched the Red Army establish control over Eastern Europe and realized that the geopolitical vacuum left by the fall of the Third Reich was being filled by a force he considered more dangerous than Nazism. Analyzing the situation at the front, Patton concluded that stopping at the Elbe River was Eisenhower's strategic blunder. Could a single general change the fate of an entire continent when politicians had already signed the papers in Yalta? The answer lay in his conviction that a conflict with the Kremlin was inevitable, and it was better to start it now while American industry was at its peak. Tension between the Allies grew daily, setting the stage for a confrontation that would take place not on the battlefield, but at a banquet table. The peace on the Elbe was merely a fragile illusion, concealing the cold calculations of two superpowers that had already begun carving out spheres of influence. Patton, as an experienced cavalry strategist whose vision always extended beyond the horizon, saw the Soviet forces not as weary allies, but as a mobile and aggressive threat with no intention of returning home. He was infuriated by Eisenhower's strategic passivity and Washington's political concessions, viewing the order to halt the advance on Berlin and Prague as a voluntary surrender of Central Europe to Stalin's long-term influence. In a letter to his wife, Beatrice, he wrote, "We promised the Europeans freedom, but instead, we handed them from one tyrant to another, and this will become the greatest disgrace in our history." His headquarters in Regensburg transformed into a center of intellectual resistance against the official Pentagon line. Patton daily scrutinized intelligence reports on the redeployment of Soviet tank corps, noting their massive numerical superiority in artillery while simultaneously pointing out the critical vulnerability of their logistics, specifically their total dependence on fuel supplies and limited rail communications. The general proposed a radical and cynical plan. Rather than disbanding the surrendering Wehrmacht divisions, they should be interned with their weapons for use as auxiliary forces in a future thrust to the east. This seemed like madness to State Department diplomats, but for a man who had led his army across Europe in 281 days of continuous combat, it was harsh military mathematics. Do you think there was a real chance at that moment to push Soviet troops back beyond Poland and Czechoslovakia without the use of nuclear weapons? Patton believed in the superiority of American mobility and firepower, and was only waiting for a formal pretext to break the chains of diplomacy and finish the job as a soldier should. The climax of this behind-the-scenes tension occurred during an official victory banquet where the glitter of crystal and the luxury of caviar could not mask the icy mutual hostility. The Soviet command sought to demonstrate its triumphant grandeur by inviting the American military elite to a dinner intended to symbolize eternal brotherhood in arms. When a Soviet general, fueled by vodka and the pathos of the moment, approached Patton with a proposal to raise a joint glass, George responded with a contemptuous silence that stilled the entire room. He ordered his translator to convey words that subsequently entered all classified intelligence reports. "Tell that son of a bitch that from this moment on, I consider him and his army our enemies, and I would rather drink with the devil than share a toast with him." This was no accidental outburst or a result of exhaustion. It was the deliberate stance of a warrior who refused to engage in political hypocrisy while the borders of a new tyranny were already being drawn on maps. The translator turned pale with fear and tried to soften the phrase, but Patton, staring directly into his opponent's eyes, insisted on the accuracy of every word. He analyzed the enemy's psychology through the lens of history, believing that the Russians, much like the Nazis, respected only raw force and viewed diplomatic politeness as a sign of decadence and weakness. This incident immediately became known at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, and triggered a literal storm in Washington. It is worth noting that the development of our channel and the ability to uncover such details depends solely on your activity. Subscribing helps us continue working with archival materials. Patton realized that after such a public defiance, his career stood on the edge of an abyss, but he consciously chose the path of direct confrontation, hoping to force Eisenhower to see the reality he was trying to ignore. The consequences of the banquet scandal were devastating and immediate. Patton began to be officially perceived not as a war hero, but as an uncontrollable threat to a fragile political balance. Dwight D. Eisenhower, forced to balance between military expediency and the increasingly acute pressure from President Truman, could no longer ignore the audacity of his most effective general. Within weeks, Patton was effectively stripped of his command of the legendary Third Army and reassigned to an administrative post in the newly formed 15th Army, which was essentially a group of officer historians engaged only in paperwork. However, Patton's prophecy began to come true much faster than the optimists in the White House expected. By the end of 1945, the Iron Curtain, the inevitability of which the general had warned about as early as April, began to drop heavily over Europe, dividing nations for decades. Patton continued to devise plans for a preemptive strike, arguing, "We must kick them out now while our ports are clogged with equipment, because in 10 years we will need 10 times the force, which we may not have." He provided detailed justifications for the superiority of American aviation, specifically P-51 Mustang fighters and B-29 strategic bombers, which could paralyze the Soviet transport network in a matter of days. In his view, it was better to make a great sacrifice today than to allow the emergence of global nuclear parity and constant fear. Do you believe his idea of arming the remnants of the German Wehrmacht for a joint campaign to the east was a mad provocation, or was it the only real chance to stop the Cold War in its tracks? Unfortunately, the general never had the opportunity to prove his point, as his life was cut short by a strange and still mystery-shrouded car accident in December of that same year. The legacy of George S. Patton remains one of the most complex and debated issues in the entire history of World War II. For official historiography, he was long considered an aggressor who didn't know when to stop, but for many, he became the last realist who saw the true face of the future enemy through the gunpowder smoke. His bitter assertion that "we won the war against one monster only to feed another" became an epitaph for an entire era of futile hopes for a stable world order. Analyzing the events of the spring of 1945, it becomes evident that Patton did not think in terms of democratic procedures, but in terms of hard geopolitics, where the only guarantor of peace is superiority in strength. He was not born for diplomatic rounds. He was a perfect weapon forged to destroy tyranny, and he sensed a new threat on an instinctive level, while others enjoyed the illusion of calm. His fate is the classic tragedy of a warrior who proved too direct and honest for an era of behind-the-scenes agreements. Today, as declassified archives reveal new details of his negotiations and plans, we are forced to look differently at that audacious toast that could have changed the world. We ask you to share your thoughts in the comments. Would human history have been less bloody if Patton's warnings had been heeded in the summer of '45? Also, please write if your family archives or stories have preserved evidence of those turbulent times, and be sure to leave a like to support our pursuit of historical accuracy. Was this man simply a war fanatic, or was he truly the only one who saw the future through the sights of his tank?